So welcome everyone to Founders Week YQG. My name is Janelle Abela. I am a business advisor with WEtech Alliance. This event is about bringing together entrepreneurs, startups, innovators, changemakers, local community organizations, local leaders, and just generally our community. Our goal is to celebrate, educate, connect, and build momentum and opportunity around our region's startup community. While this event is virtual, we would like to respectfully acknowledge that the land on which we gather today is the traditional lands of the Three Fires Confederacy of First Nations, comprised of the Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi peoples. We are grateful to work, learn, and live in this area. So this week can't be made possible without our generous sponsors, so I want to quickly thank them. Province of Ontario, St. Clair College Alumni Association, the Job Shop, Libro Credit Union, Workforce WindsorEssex, Baker Tilly, Windsor LLP, Alpha Core Group, VentureIt, EPICentre, Small Business Center, Small Business and Entrepreneurship Center, Genesis Entrepreneurship Center, and WEtech Alliance. Thank you for putting founders first. For more information about our sponsors, you can check us out at WEtech-Alliance.com/FoundersWeek. So today's session is hosted by WEtech Alliance. WEtech Alliance is one of 17 regional innovation centers funded by the province of Ontario, serving the WindsorEssex and Chatham-Kent regions. We provide entrepreneurs with business services, training, mentorship, and strategic connections to help bring new ideas to market, scale to the next level, and build a dynamic culture and a community of innovation. The WEtech mission is to help start and grow tech and tech-enabled companies and champion innovation in WindsorEssex and Chatham-Kent. To learn more about us, please visit WEtech-Alliance.com. So now just some quick housekeeping items. I know this could maybe be your first or 15th session of the week, so I'll try and be quick with that. To be considerate and accommodate everyone attending today, we are doing things a bit differently by leveraging Zoom webinar. So you might not be able to see the attendees, but you'll have ample opportunity to engage with our guests today through the Q&A and during the Q&A session. So please feel free to use the chat feature located at the bottom of the Zoom window and engage with any of the attendees. Should you experience any technical difficulties, please reach out in the chat box as well. This session is recorded and a video file, audio file, and all relevant links will be available on WEtech Alliance's YouTube channel and included in the follow-up email. We're also streaming live on WEtech Alliance's Facebook page. And finally, let's make sure everyone knows Founders Week YQG is where it's at. So be sure to share your hashtag Founders Week YQG experience on Twitter, LinkedIn, Instagram, and Facebook. Now I would like to welcome our guest today, Mallory McKewen. She is the Senior Account Manager in the technology industry sector at BDC, and she will be sharing her guide to helping you design your funding roadmap. On behalf of Founders Week YQG team, thank you, Mallory, for joining us today, and we are so excited to learn from you.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. Are you ready for me to go ahead and share my deck?
Ready to go.
Perfect. Okay, so I'm sharing my screen now. I'll have a deck. I will try to race through it so it's not, too boring and there's time for questions and things like that. I'll try to get through this in the first 20 minutes. Oh, it looks like I got an error saying the host disabled participant screen sharing. I can't share it.
We will work to get that sorted quickly for you.
Oh, I think it's already, now it's letting me. Okay, can we see a title slide now?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Perfect. Okay, so the topic today is around designing your funding roadmap. Oops, sorry. I'll start super quickly introducing myself and BDC. Then I've kind of broken down some different funding options based on the stage of company. It won't be an exhaustive list, but it's a couple of things to consider. And then we'll get into a little bit about debt versus equity, pros and cons of each, timing that makes sense for each, when kind of a hybrid of both makes sense and stuff like that. And then we'll open it up since it's an AMA, make sure there's lots of time for anyone to ask questions or just to make it an engaging conversation. So, hey everyone, I'm Mallory. I'm technically stationed in Kitchener, but I'm the tech expert within BDC, or that's what they call me. So it's my job to support all tech or fast-growing companies within Southwestern Ontario. So Windsor's a really important market, and we see a lot of tech companies actually spinning out of Windsor. It's not all kind of in Kitchener-Waterloo, down the 401 and on the way to like London and Windsor. We're seeing a lot of really cool tech companies as well. Unfortunately, in the past kind of 2 years, I haven't been able to visit much in person, but things are opening up. So hopefully I'll be able to meet some of you in person in Windsor at some point soon. But yeah, my role is kind of to be that resource for tech companies and kind of the quarterback to BDC, because I find a lot of companies have heard of BDC, have maybe seen our ads somewhere, just know that BDC exists. Maybe we sponsored an event you've gone to, but don't necessarily know how we can help or at what stage. And it's a bit of a confusing place. We've got kind of three pillars, from like advisory to our venture capital arm. We do a lot of lending. So I'm kind of your quarterback, because we see that tech and high growth companies often end up like feeling the benefit of tapping into all aspects of BDC. My background, so before joining BDC, I was a e-commerce entrepreneur. So I founded an e-commerce company, and I went through a couple of accelerators and things like that. So if I'd lived in Windsor, I definitely would have been a member of WEtech. And I raised 1.6 million for that company through a mix of debt and equity and grants. So kind of was in your shoes like 5 or 6 years ago as I was working on growing that company before I stepped down from my company and moved over to BDC to support companies like the ones that I was growing. A little bit about BDC, I kind of just mentioned. There's kind of three key pillars: financing, so debt lending, venture capital, so equity investments, and growth funding, and then advisory services is another big arm of BDC that we don't talk about as often. We've got more than 3,500 tech clients in Canada. It's a huge mandate of contributing entrepreneurs from almost got a dedicated tech team. That's me for Southwestern Ontario. We also have dedicated authorizers and underwriters. So sometimes tech companies maybe on paper aren't like quote unquote bankable. But we understand that. We understand that often tech companies are reinvesting all their revenue and growth. So maybe they're still in burn mode. Those typical ratios that you kind of would think of that a bank would look at might be a little bit out of whack. That's okay, because our underwriters and authorizers look at only tech companies all day, every day, and are trying to support as many of them as we can. Yeah, try to be a one-stop shop. I kind of talked about that with myself being the quarterback. But now we'll get into the actual sort of meat of the presentation, if we will. So one thing I like to think about, and this is how I always thought when I was an entrepreneur, to really be in the driver's seat as the CEO or as the founder, is to think about the best way of funding your business is through revenue. So it's bringing in cash from your customers and reinvesting that in growing your business and making sure that, you know, the revenue that you're generating can, at the very least, kind of keep your people employed, keep the lights on. And then debt and equity is used as an accelerator. So that's when you're pouring fuel on the fire. You need more cash to grow more quickly, but you can keep some baseline level alive. I think that's the ideal state to be in. When a company is early stage, you might need that angel round kickstart or something like that to get you started before you can get to this point. And that's, I mean, totally understandable. But I think that's something that's really important to think about. It puts you in the driver's seat. You're in control if you know that you can keep this business going at some baseline, and that money you raise or that debt that you take on is just to pour fuel on the fire. That lets you make sure that you're not in a rush to close a round. You're really vetting out the perhaps equity investors, making sure they're a good fit for your business. You're getting the best terms you can on any debt, and there's kind of no desperation there. Okay, getting into some funding options by stage. So when we look at pre-revenue companies, and I don't know kind of the audience on the call, so I'll go through kind of the 3 stages I have here, and then in the Q&A, we'll make sure we focus on what's most important to those of you who are here. But pre-revenue company, that's kind of maybe a company that's at the ideation stage, gathering market feedback, product is in development, there's some R&D going on. Maybe there are unpaid pilots, but there really isn't any revenue there yet. How do you get a pre-revenue company funded? One, I usually suggest to run as lean as possible. The reason for that is if you need a lot of money, at a really early stage, the best way to get it is probably through equity because it's more patient. There's no repayment terms attached to it, but your valuation is going to be quite low if you're at the pre-revenue stage. So if you need a really big chunk of money, you might be diluting yourself quite a bit early. So running lean until you get some traction going is often a smart decision. And I think a lot of books that we talk about, like the Lean Startup and those type of books, they all kind of walk through like how to get to your MVP, how to get some initial traction before you need to start spending a lot of money. In many cases for these pre-revenue companies, the founder, if there's some cash available there, is investing often on like a due to shareholder, expecting to be paid back at some point, putting some skin in the game to get things started. Pitch competitions really can be fruitful at this time, both for a bit of cash with the prize money, and it's usually grants, so like non-dilutive, no interest, no repayment. Pitch competitions are also just a really good way to start to get feedback and know like how your pitch and your concept is going to fare when you do start going out and pitching for actual investment. So I definitely suggest those for early stage companies. And Futurepreneur is another potential option for entrepreneurs under 39. So those are small loans, but often good to get you started. Moving into early revenue. So that might be when the company has small revenue from pilots. The forecast, though, is still somewhat uncertain. So you know that there's some traction here. There's probably some product market fit because people are putting some money into whatever it is that you're offering. But you might not be at the point where you've got a repeatable process that you can really scale. Maybe it's just early adopters that have kind of subscribed to your pilot or started to become customers. Maybe you haven't invested in marketing yet, so you haven't really figured out your cost of customer acquisition. So there's some uncertainty in your forecast still, but there's some revenue. You're feeling pretty confident that there's something here. So at that stage, try to continue to run as lean as possible. I really like to see a company that runs pretty lean until they've kind of found that repeatable process that can scale, and then they go out and do that big raise and or take on significant debt to I keep using this kind of metaphor, but to pour fuel on that fire. But it didn't cost a fortune to get to this point. The entrepreneurs were kind of smart and made smart investments in getting there. Grants, it really depends on kind of your sector and what you're building, what grants will be available to you. It's really good that you're tapped in with WEtech and on this call. WEtech can be really helpful. Like all the accelerators can be really helpful at linking companies up with the right potential resources. If you're a company with heavy R&D, this is a time when IRAP might be able to get involved. IRAP's a really great grant program. So again, when the company's pretty early stage, it's nice to tap into as many grants as possible because there are no repayment terms and you're not diluting yourself. At this stage, based on the revenue generated, you may be eligible for some working capital loans. It would be a good time to start talking to someone like me to see what BDC might be able to do. It's just important to keep in mind with those working capital loans that you want to have some level of certainty in your forecast, since those loans will have repayment terms attached to them. Angel investors, maybe a friends and family round. This is really the time when you see most companies kind of pitching at angel groups and stuff like that. Early revenue and traction, not quite ready maybe for institutional venture capital, but something really promising is starting up here. And often at this phase, your primary bank, so not BDC, but whoever you bank with kind of day to day, would likely extend a credit card. Eventually, you want to build up kind of your credit with the bank to have a line of credit, but they probably won't be able to extend that at the early revenue stage. Okay, when we get into growth stage, this really is when you're pouring fuel on the fire. I even wrote it in text in the deck there, but you've kind of found that repeatable process that you can scale. You know a little bit about your cost of acquisition. You know how you're finding customers. Now it's about, spreading this out and getting more customers signed on. That's when the funding options really open up. Debt, mezzanine financing, meaning financing that sits below your primary lender, so your primary bank. You might be able to access a line of credit from your bank at this point. Definitely a line of credit can be a useful tool, having kind of that revolving facility available to you, even if you don't need to draw on it, or your forecast kind of says you might be okay without it. You're not paying interest on what you haven't drawn. But if you've got a cash flow gap, meaning maybe you need to pay your suppliers in 30 days, but your like accounts receivables are on average 60 days turn, that's where a line of credit can come in really handy. Equity, so angel and VC, this is when you might be getting into the later series rounds as you just keep kind of hitting those next milestones of growth. And then obviously it's really important to think about kind of having a customer funded business as well, reinvesting the revenues that you brought in and growing the business, maybe growing the team, investing in ad spend, whatever it may be. Okay, this is my last set of slides, and then I'll open it up to questions. So just kind of breaking down debt to equity and when each one might make the most sense for your business. Okay, equity. When we get into equity, there are lots of types of instruments that people use, especially for early stage round. So safes are something, so simple agreement for future equity. That's something that's getting more and more common. It's a really founder-friendly instrument. It's fast and it's simple. You're not really getting hung up on the valuation. It converts at a subsequent round. So you don't really need to worry about valuation today. There will be a discount or a cap at the next round. So you might be setting a cap, but you don't need to say, my company is worth X on this day. And with a safe specifically, that's really how it differs from a convertible note. There's no maturity date and no interest. It's really counting on a future round coming into play. The next type of equity is a convertible note. So that's really a hybrid of debt and equity. When we, as a bank, are looking at a convertible note on a company's balance sheet, we really consider it to be equity, because usually when someone is investing in the form of a convertible note, they want to become a shareholder in this company. They want to participate in the upside. The debt portion is kind of a fallback plan, I guess I would say. So it does include a maturity date. It does accrue interest. That's kind of how it differs from a safe. But again, it's really beneficial because, especially for that early stage company, you don't have to go back and forth and determine a valuation today. You'd usually set a discount saying, at this date or at a round of a material amount, this convertible note would convert to equity at a discount of X. And then the third type of equity is just a straight price round. This is the simplest form, but also the most complex. It's the simplest because there's no debentures involved. There's no kind of conversion date or conversion activity down the line, probably a little bit less cumbersome in terms of legal fees and stuff like that. But it's complex because if you're just, going to have a straight price round, you need to negotiate and determine valuation, which is just really challenging for an early stage kind of pre-revenue company. In the early those companies that are break, well, how does that work and what's my company worth? So it becomes really an artistic conversation. But a price round would just be, there's an agreement, you're going to buy X number of shares or X percentage of my company in exchange for X dollars of investment. Okay, debt, I'll speed through this one. So there's secured debt. That would be like if you're buying equipment, if you're buying an office space for your building. So not so much when you're thinking about kind of like your funding roadmap and how you're going to grow a tech company. But yeah, kind of like a secured loan. Often your primary bank likes to be able to tie a loan to a security. That's because it's much lower risk for everyone. Because if you're unable to pay the debt, there's an asset tied to it, and that asset would be sold, and the debt could be repaid out of that. The next level of debt there is unsecured term debt. That's what I'm doing mostly all day, every day with BDC's tech group. So these are working capital loans or cash flow for growth loans. There's no collateral behind them. You're not going out and buying an asset or some equipment with the loan. You're investing it in growing your team, maybe a little bit of ad spend, things like that. And ultimately, the financing is dependent on a couple of things. One, it would be the creditworthiness of the borrower. For an early stage company, there might not be a credit history in the business. So we might look at the entrepreneurs and say, okay, does the entrepreneur have a good credit score? Because often the management team, if they're good at repaying their debt, the same kind of tendencies will follow through in the business. But that's pretty high risk debt because we're not tying it to an asset. So if the company ultimately can't afford to repay the debt, there's no way for it to be repaid. The loan would typically be written off. So these loans can be a little bit more expensive than, say, a real estate loan, but usually cheaper than equity when you're thinking about, the milestones you're expecting to hit and how much equity would actually cost. The interest rate on a term loan is usually less than what you would see on kind of the dilution of yourself through an equity round. And then the third type of debt is revolving debt. That's, a line of credit. Banks typically are using some sort of margining. So a line of credit isn't typically, highly secured, but they're thinking about maybe margining against your accounts receivables or your inventory, something like that. So there's, I guess, like really good math behind how they can get to the number that they're offering on a line of credit. Tech companies, we're starting to see some of the banks come forward with a multiple of monthly recurring revenue and kind of using that as to where they can get on a line of credit. So that's a really positive step because previously we were seeing that, a line of credit would be really helpful for this tech company to grow and to manage their cash flow. But since they're a really asset-light company, there's not really a way to get them done. So things are getting better in that sense. So I would say when your company is eligible for a line of credit, it's definitely something good to have in your toolkit. Okay, pros and cons of equity. Equity can really fuel rapid growth. It's patient, so you can take it on earlier when you're not quite as certain about your cash flow forecast. You're more thinking about the potential of the company, but you don't know everything about kind of how your cash flows and your budget is going to work out. You don't need to repay equity, so you're not going to have to be putting aside a portion of revenue for principal repayment. And in many cases, an equity investor can really be beneficial to the company. They might join your board of directors, your board of advisors, become a mentor to the entrepreneur. They may have had a past successful exit in a similar industry, so they can really bring some credibility to the business or help the founder. The downsides of equity, the biggest one is dilution. So depending on what the company's valued at, you're trading shares in your company for that cash to grow the company. So, you're now sharing in the upside with the equity investors that you bring in. The new partners may want to say in decisions, which in many cases can be very positive. You've got smart high net worth individuals or people from VC funds around the table helping to support the entrepreneur. Sometimes that might be like a lot of, there might be competing priorities, more people that you feel that you're needing to listen to. It may muddle things as an entrepreneur. So that's just something to keep in mind. I don't really think of that as a drawback of equity, more a reason to really make sure that the people you're bringing around the table are the right people. And raising equity is usually a long process. People normally say kind of reserve 6 to 8 months to be really focused on raising that round. So you want to make sure you don't get yourself into a position as the entrepreneur where you're constantly kind of raising. You want to think, okay, I'm raising X dollars. My forecast says that's going to get me to this next milestone. And when I get there, I'm going to raise X dollars then. So it's really important to think about your rounds and what milestones they'll get you to make sure your valuation's higher at the next round, and to make sure you don't just land in this spot where you're constantly kind of trying to straddle the line of growing and leading the business, but also raising funds. Equity investors often say the entrepreneur is the reason they invest, which is great. But for that reason, they want to spend some time with the entrepreneur. So they're going to be taking your time. You'll be producing things for them. You also want to be spending time with them, make sure they're the right fit for you. It's just a time-consuming activity. So that's something to keep in mind. On the flip side, debt also has pros and cons. I work on our tech lending team, so obviously I see the pros, but there are some cons that are really important to consider to determine what's right for your business. The biggest pro is there's no dilution. A lender is typically silent. We might ask for your financial statements annually, but we're not really involved in decision making or anything like that. We've lent the money and trusted the business and the entrepreneur to deal with it. Potentially lower cost than equity investment. Usually if you're kind of comparing the interest rate versus the dilution at like an exit event or something like that, debt ends up being cheaper. Interest payments are tax deductible, which is a nice plus. And we can be really flexible with payment terms. But that's also, payment of a loan is a downside of the debt. It needs to be repaid. So you need to have some confidence in your forecast to be sure that you're not putting yourself in a tough situation later as the payment terms start coming to fruition. In some cases, debt might require some sort of collateral. That's not really the case in BDC's loans or a personal guarantee, which is the case in a lot of early stage BDC loans. So that's something you need to think about. You want to make sure that you're keeping a healthy balance sheet. You're not taking on so much debt that, say, your debt to equity ratio gets kind of turned upside down if there's not a lot of retained earnings in the business yet because it's still burning to grow. So you might want to think about having a hybrid of debt and equity to keep that balance sheet healthy. And yeah, upside of equity was that you get smart people around the table. With debt, you're not really getting that. It's positive that you don't have, another voice in your ear, but you don't necessarily have, another voice in your ear to help out. BDC does have a really awesome advisory department, which we see helps our companies substantially. So we can help on the advisory side. It doesn't come automatically with a loan. And I'll open it up to questions now. This slide just kind of breaks down when debt and equity make sense, but I think my biggest takeaway would be that most companies are growing with a hybrid of kind of bootstrapping and reinvesting revenues, debt, and equity. And in many cases, they're raising around and bringing debt in as a portion of it to minimize dilution. And in other cases, you're using debt to bridge a gap or get further before the next funding round. But I will leave it at that and open it up to any questions.
Thank you, Mallory. And there are a couple questions coming in. The first is there specific Canadian technologies you see getting funded at a higher rate than others, or even industries specifically?
I mean, one thing I see, so on my side, I'm on the lending side, we're really not partial to industries. So to answer that specifically, we're really not partial. We just want to see a company, that's contributing to the Canadian economy and will have an ability to repay the debt. But on the kind of venture capital side, uh, I see like B2B companies in many cases have an easier time getting funded. It's not a reason to not start a B2C company,
Mhm.
but usually B2B, I mean, it's just kind of easier to understand and often faster to scale a
Do
B2B
you think
company.
do you think with the B2B, even if it's like is it like in like advanced manufacturing, or is this typically like in a certain industry, or is it just generally B2B?
I mean, one thing I've seen is like I find from what I see, a B2B SaaS company is the fastest one to raise venture capital. The reason for that is, I mean, SaaS provides some future growth, like highly scalable. When you see like MRR today, you know it's pretty sticky and like it's just going to grow from there. So probably the easiest companies that I've seen, and again, I'm not on the venture capital side myself, but from what I've seen by being kind of active in the communities, is B2B SaaS companies tend to have probably the easiest time raising funds, but there are lots of other companies, B2C, hardware, lots of different types of companies that are still able to raise what they need.
Okay. And so this next question, it comes in two parts. So if you want to take on investment, but you're still in that early ideation stage, what can you do to prepare for funding? And then the second part of that is what resources does BDC provide to help people kind of learn about that process and support their business?
Yeah, so I think for an early stage company thinking about wanting to take on funding, um, and like how to make it interesting for investors. I think something and how to make sure that there will be a valuation that makes sense. Something to think about is just how do I prove traction? And traction is not always in the form of revenue. Revenue is ideal because it's ultimately what you're going to be going for. But some companies, depending on the type of company, aren't able to make it to revenue generating before they raise a round. Just they're too capital intensive. So in that case, I would say just try to find a way to prove out traction. Think about what are the steps that people are taking before they convert to revenue generating, and how do I get them there to show that there is interest, there is product market fit. It'll be hard to find investors with an idea, but with something that you've been able to prove out that there's some level of product market fit, even if it's not yet revenue generating because you don't have the cash to take it there, you'll have a lot better luck.
Wonderful. Are you finding that there's any trends that are currently existing kind of in the financing market in Canada then?
Um, the only trend that I've noticed from my seat is that like there is a lot of investment going into tech companies. Tech is broad, but I think one thing that we saw was these tech companies that are kind of built to be agile and scalable and maybe a little bit non-traditional. We saw that through COVID, they were able to pivot quickly, or maybe their business even did better because of COVID for whatever reason. Um, but more importantly, tech companies are kind of like innately more agile. So they were able to pivot quickly. So I think we've seen a lot of investment dollars go there because people saw, okay, that the tech is super broad, but those kind of innovative companies were able to pivot and weather the storm or pivot and do even better. Um, so
And we're seeing a
yeah,
lot of people pivot into tech,
yeah,
especially with the pandemic now. People are reworking their ideas. So I think that that kind of is reflective there too. So it's great to hear that that market is growing.
definitely.
So the next question is, you mentioned that you raised money with your personal company. Curious, how many no's did you have to go through before getting to a yes? This is funny because this afternoon we have our failure night event. So we're talking about failing and kind of going through that process of getting back up. So I'd love to hear your story about that.
Yeah, a lot. The company that I started was, I guess, to step back. For early stage investment, a lot of high net worth individuals, are often, I guess if you think about the room, it's probably advanced even in the past 5 years, but if you think about the room at a typical angel investor night, like a pitch session where there are a bunch of high net worth individuals in the room, it's mostly older males. And that's just kind of the reality. And my business was, it's called Bridesmaids. We rented and we designed size adjustable bridesmaid dresses and rented them out. So really, really feminine business. Not
Great
something.
business though. They always say you collect bridesmaids dresses that you only ever wear once. That idea blows me away. I would be into that.
Like there's a lot of good stuff there. Often in front of a room of, middle-aged to older men, they didn't understand the problem because they never faced themselves. And of course,
we might have just lost connection for a short second. While we reconnect with Mallory, if you have questions, please feel free to put them in the chat or in the Q&A box. It's a great conversation we're having about funding, so hopefully we can reconnect with her.
It was so different. But yeah, there were a lot of no's early because when I first started out, the pitch deck looked like it could have been on our website. And it did not resonate to the room. So there were a lot of early no's, but I kind of learned from each of those no's and said, okay, you know what? These people care about the numbers. They don't care about the colors. They care about how well I know my business and how well I know my market, and just
I think we might be in and out of that connection. So hi Mal, you're cutting in and out just slightly. No worries. We did get the gist of your no's, and perfect. That is more about knowing your business and really being prepared with that pitch deck and coming in strong in the knowledge of your business rather than kind of focusing on the idea itself, which I think is super beneficial for our attendees, because sometimes if you think about, is someone going to like my idea, it's not as much about that. It's about how much do you know about your business, how much do you know about the market, and are you going to be successful? So I appreciate you sharing that story.
Yeah, for sure, of course.
We have a couple more questions coming in. Equity is easy to assess in terms of how much you'd potentially want to give up to investors. How can I find out how much debt is appropriate for my business?
I think the answer to that really comes from your business's cash flow forecast. So, preparing, a top line forecast of what you expect to come in, your budget, I would break it down by month. I used to always break this down on a rolling 12-month basis because obviously you don't know your cash flows very well beyond 12 months. At BDC, we like to see 18 to 24 months just to know if the company thinks it'll be able to make payments. But yeah, I think the answer to that really comes down to your cash flow forecast. And if you're struggling to create a cash flow forecast, which is fair, it's hard, especially at the early stages, there's a lot of guessing. But if you feel like it's 80% a guess, you might not be ready to take on debt because you don't want to guess at whether you'll be able to make payments. Mm-hmm. But if you feel really confident in a portion of your forecast and then some of the growth is more optimistic and stuff like that, well, maybe you can take on a certain level of debt for the portion that you're confident in, and then the rest you'd want to be equity because the equity is more patient, you don't have to pay it back.
Awesome, thank you. And another question: if I'm a new startup making significant investments into R&D to support growth, with very little cash flow, and this kind of goes back to our last question, not going towards development, should I be looking at financing still, or would equity be more appropriate at my current stage? So very little cash flow, but significant investments into R&D.
Yeah, usually at the R&D stages, equity makes more sense. Equity and grants, like if IRAP's available or other grants are available, that's great. But equity, if you're focused more on development, less on commercialization, I think debt for the commercialization portion makes a lot of sense. Taking on a little bit of debt to hire a third salesperson when you've already got two salespeople kind of proving out how productive they are, or debt for ad spend when you've already kind of proven out, your cost per click and conversions and stuff like that. That's really, really solid. Putting debt into development, it could maybe be a part of the mix, but you probably wouldn't want to fund development entirely with debt because future cash flows are still probably a bit uncertain.
Yeah. And I think that kind of goes with the next question is, what is BDC's rate for loans? So kind of contributing to that, what kind of debt or cash flow projections is someone putting themselves into?
Yeah, so BDC's interest rate, we price all of our loans based on risk in the file. So it really, really depends on the company. There are a couple of things that we look at to determine risk. One is that kind of cash flow forecasts. Another is perhaps the entrepreneur's personal credit score for an early stage company. For a later stage company, it would be the credit score of the business, historical financial statements, things like that, all kind of go into calculating what an interest rate would be. Ultimately, like currently our base rate, so all of our loans are priced as our base rate plus or minus a variance, and the variance is the risk kind of part. The base rate is currently 4.55%. Most secured loans are 4.55% minus something. So something less than 4.55. All unsecured loans, so growth loans, working capital loans, are 4.55 plus some variance for risk. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, it's always going to be cheaper than like credit card debt. That's another kind of unsecured type of debt. It'll always be cheaper than that. But it really depends on the stage that the company's at and the likelihood of repayment.
Of course. Thank you. Okay, so this next question is, how can I utilize debt for the growth of my business?
It really depends on the company, but I would say debt is used, like my clients or companies that are coming to me, there's usually a few reasons. One, if the company does not want to take on equity, they don't want to dilute themselves, they want to remain that, sole shareholder or something, but they've got a growth plan. They want to grow faster than just reinvesting revenues allows them to. That's mm-hmm. where debt can come in really handy. We're kind of like the gas pedal to grow faster. You've got more cash up front that you just chip away at on payment terms. So you can invest a bunch in growing your team or ad spend or developing maybe a second product, something like that. Another spot where we come in to help grow your business is to be a part of a round. So I've seen that happen often. Maybe a company is raising a 500K seed round. Maybe we'll come in with 150K. They'll raise 350K through a convertible note or straight commons or whatever it may be. That can be helpful because you're only diluting yourself on the 350K, but you're getting 500 to take to the next level. And you also now only have to have the repayment terms of 150K. So it's kind of a nice mix of mm-hmm. both to take the company.
That sounds like it's a pretty short-term kind of engagement. Is there a minimum or like a maximum length that you work with clients, or is it kind of like the business's range depending on like what they're coming to BDC for?
So usually we grow with our clients. So often a company will first come to BDC because their primary bank isn't able to offer anything yet. So BDC is able to maybe provide a loan a little bit earlier to a company, that doesn't have a lot of assets on the balance sheet. There's not really anything to secure a loan against or margin it against. So BDC can come to the table entirely unsecured. And that's where we kind of first get involved. Because the primary bank just isn't able to support yet. So we're another option to complement it. And then from there, we usually end up growing with the business. I've got companies in my portfolio that are I got some that are under 100K in revenue that we recently brought on as a client. And I've got some that are like 40 million revenue plus, and they're still coming back to us to fund their growth as opposed to diluting themselves because they're pretty certain about their future cash flows. So, yeah, really all stages of businesses, but we're seeing a lot of tech companies start with us young when there's not really anyone else to support. And then, keep growing their commitment with us as the company grows.
So it sounds like you have opportunities for people to engage with you short term, but eventually they just kind of stick around because the benefits that they're finding with using BDC.
Definitely. And I find something I answer a lot at the term sheet stage are questions about how do I prepay the loan? My forecast says we're going to be super cash flush in 2 years. This loan's on a 6-year term. What do I do if I've got all this extra cash and I want to pay it down early? And we build in really flexible prepayment terms because that's an important question that comes up often. So we're really flexible if a company wants to prepay. Mm-hmm. I rarely see a company actually prepay because the entrepreneur ends up realizing okay, we've got all this extra cash, we could prepay the loan, but the ROI that we're getting from reinvesting that cash into hiring another person or more ad spend or whatever it might be well exceeds the cost of the interest rate. So why would I pay it down? Because I can just keep on investing this and growing my business more and more.
Exactly. Wow. Well, thank you, Mallory. Thank you so much for engaging with us today and sharing all of the knowledge you have on funding. On behalf of Founders Week YQG, we can't wait to engage with you more and keep learning about what BDC can do for all of our entrepreneurs. We do have a quick survey for our attendees in the chat. Please click the link and provide feedback on this session, and we will enter you for a giveaway a $50 Windsor card. There are more sessions this afternoon. So we have right after this at 12 o'clock, while you're having your lunch, learn about Windsor Pizza with a fireside chat with George Calavas and our very own Yvonne Pilon. And then at 1 o'clock, we have from freelance small business owners hiring your first employee. At 3, we have machine learning. And tonight, of course, is failure night. So tune in at 6 and learn more about what it means to really fail. So Mallory, thank you so much for being with us today. It was really, really awesome to learn with you, and I'm so grateful to have this opportunity.
Yes, thank you all for having me. I know I didn't get to see anyone on the call, but I guess nice to meet you all. Feel free to add me on LinkedIn if I can be helpful. Don't hesitate to reach out.
Wonderful. Thank you, everyone, and we'll see you at our next session in 10 minutes.